Welcome back. This is the second hour of the live broadcast of Truth Jihad Radio. I'm Kevin Barrett, broadcasting live from an undisclosed location in the western Wisconsin woods. If you want to help out, keep me on the air, please go to truthjihad.com. You can subscribe by the Patreon button, or you could always drop a tip in the PayPal jar over at truthjihad.com. All right, this hour I am pleased and honored to bring back one of the pillars of the alternative media, maybe even the central pillar of alternative media such as it is. That is Ron Unz of the Unz Review. He's, of course, the author of the magnificent American Pravda series, which you can now find in ebook form. You can find it in audiobook form, and you should inflict this on anybody in your family or circle of friends that's bright and curious and wants to know what's really happening in the world. It's really good stuff. And his latest piece is American Pravda, COVID-19, its impact and origins after 1 year as we rapidly approach 1 million American deaths. It offers what I think is the best supported hypothesis about where COVID-19 came from. And Ron has suffered some pushback from the establishment, which blacked out Unz Review immediately after this article was published. Suddenly, Facebook and other social media no longer allowed you to post anything from the Unz Review. His own articles have been shadow banned. Well, I guess that's the sort of thing that happens when you tell uncomfortable truths or make statements that appear to be pretty close to the likely truth that turns out to be a very incendiary truth. So, hey, Ron, it's great to have you back.
Hey, great to be here.
Okay, well, so this COVID issue is so hot right now. They're banning all sorts of people, and yet social media and conservative mainstream media are still full of people we might call COVID minimizers who are against lockdowns and masking and distancing and things like that. They think it's not as bad as it's been portrayed. Your website is full of commenters and even authors who think along those lines. Your perspective is quite different. So maybe you could give us a sense of where you diverge from that group of people.
Sure. Well, I mean, as far as I can tell, based on all the evidence I've seen, the disease itself is pretty much the way the mainstream media is portraying it. In other words, from the beginning, one thing that I think may have caused this sort of minimizer backlash is some of the original accounts of the COVID epidemic when it first began were extremely exaggerated. Apparently, especially on some sort of conspiracy websites like Zero Hedge or some, right-wing websites, there were all these stories going around or videos going around that the fatality rate was like 5% or 10%, and that a gigantic fraction of the world's population would die, because obviously if a disease that's very contagious kills 5 or 10% of the population, and if America has 330 million people, if you do the arithmetic, that's an awful lot of deaths. Now, most of the mainstream coverage at that same time was actually turned out to, as far as I can tell, much more accurate. In other words, if you read the New York Times or the sort of mainstream media, in that period, they were sort of indicating that the death rate was probably around 1%, maybe 0.5%, maybe more than 1%, but roughly in the 1% range. And as far as I can tell, that seems to have been what the actual facts ended up being. In other words, even many of the people who first had very exaggerated views of how fatal the disease was have now admitted that, it's probably more like 1% fatal. While on the other hand, some of the people initially who then went in the other direction and claimed that it was not at all dangerous are pretty much admitting it's probably, roughly on average 0.5% or 1% fatal. Now, one thing that has caused a tremendous amount of confusion and, sometimes I think been used by some of the people to sort of spread misconceptions is that from the beginning, everybody recognized that COVID-19 has an extremely age-skewed fatality curve. In other words, as far as I can tell from what I've seen, individuals who get the disease who are over 60 are probably 100 times or more likely to die than people who get the disease who are under 40. So when you're talking about such an enormous age skew with, such a large fraction of the deaths being people in their late 60s or 70s or 80s, that obviously makes it more difficult to work out the average numbers. But it seems like the average fatality rate for a typical community is somewhere in the 0.5% to 1% range. And, that's still a very large number when you're talking about an entire society. There's also been a great deal of disagreement regarding the proper treatments for the disease. In other words, there have been claims floating around that certain treatments are very effective and other people debunking those claims and other people counter-debunking those claims. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't really formed any solid judgment there. In other words, whether some of these other treatments ranging from, that compound people were talking about for a while to, for example, very heavy doses of vitamin D really are effective in treating the illness may or may not be the case. I don't think the case has really been settled yet. And obviously there are a lot of suspicions that the pharmaceutical companies, which don't make a lot of money by selling vitamin D, but make a lot of money through, much more complicated and expensive treatments plus vaccines, may be deliberately underplaying the value of some of those other treatments, which might possibly be the case. And so, to some extent, I've really stayed away from a lot of those day-to-day issues about the disease. In other words, the proper treatments. And also, another point I should make is there's been a lot of debate over the effectiveness of masking and lockdowns, which are obviously very controversial in certain circles. And at first, I thought probably lockdowns might be fairly effective, but there's been a lot of new evidence that come out that at least the Western types of lockdowns, which tend to be intermittent and half-hearted, really haven't done much good at all.
In China, where they nail you in, they board your door shut. That works pretty well, apparently.
The whole thing about it is, if you're not serious about it, a lockdown can be effective as a very short-term strategy for a few weeks, giving you a chance to really come up with a much broader or more complete solution to the illness, to the outbreak. But if you put in the lockdown for a few weeks and then you don't do any of those other things, and then the lockdown extends to a few months and then 6 months and then to some extent a year, the evidence seems to me it's not really that effective. To give you one example, California went for a very strict lockdown at the beginning, very early and very strict. And a state like Florida really opposed lockdowns initially, and then when they implemented them, really implemented them in a much softer way. And if you went back 5 or 6 months ago, the California death rate was much, much lower than that of Florida, I think probably by a factor of 2 or 3 or more. But since that time, really, California's death rate has been creeping up, and now it's not that different from Florida. So that seems to show that the sort of lockdowns tried in California haven't worked out very well. On the other hand, just as you said, in China, where they put in a few weeks of very, very strict lockdowns and stamped out the disease entirely, ordinary life has gone back to normal. In other words, there are no more lockdowns. People wear masks, but sometimes they don't even bother with masks. And China has had almost no deaths by comparison to other countries. So, the industries, life is back to normal in China. So if you're going to go for a lockdown, it could be going for a very strict early lockdown and completely stamping out the disease works, while anything less than that really doesn't seem very effective. And there's also been a lot of debate over whether masks really are effective or not. And I haven't really formed a solid judgment there, but the case seems a lot more doubtful than people were indicating maybe 8 or 9 months ago.
I agree completely. The stuff I've seen shows at best a few percentage points lower transmission with masking, and that I think University of New Hampshire study showed that the people who refused to wear masks were actually contacting and transmitting COVID less than the people who wear masks. And the reason for that appears to be that the maskless people have fewer contacts. So the most important issue is number of contacts, and masks are just marginal.
Exactly. And another factor is just from a psychological point of view. If people believe that masks are tremendous benefit, they may be overconfident, and they may take more risks that otherwise unmasked people wouldn't. and that may actually outweigh the impact of the mask itself. So, again, I haven't seen whether there have been enough solid, controlled studies to really decide the issue. But it seems a much more doubtful case for masking than I sort of had been led to believe maybe 8 or 9 months ago.
Right. Well, I'm with you on all of this, and I'm also with you on your hypothesis about where it probably came from, although I think I might go a little further than you and speculate more about deeper agendas. But so let's hear the short version of your hypothesis about where it came from, which you lay out in more explicit detail in this new article on the impact and origins of COVID than you had in the past. That is about the U.S. military games team in Wuhan in October and so on.
Sure. Well, the whole thing about it is when the outbreak first began in China, one of the issues that, really captured the imagination of the world with the headlines was, the sudden eruption of a mysterious new disease in, a city of 11 million people in China, very large city, even though it wasn't well known in the West. And, as suddenly the disease began spreading, possibly spreading to other countries, and then eventually spreading to the United States, there obviously was a tremendous amount of effort on the part of the Trump administration, which had underplayed the disease and really had sort of ignored the whole thing, to try to focus the blame on China and really say that the Chinese were at fault for not having alerted the world to this deadly new disease that erupted in their country, and thereby allowing it to gain a foothold in other countries, first in parts of Europe and Iran, and then eventually in the United States, where, it's killed a huge number of people in America. So because of the focus of the Trump administration on what seemed to me from the beginning a very doubtful argument that the Chinese had covered up the disease or had known about it much longer than the world had, the major media in the West, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, a lot of other people, ended up devoting tremendous investigative resources to determining exactly when the Chinese government learned of the disease and how they learned of it and facts like that. And it seems almost conclusively established right now by all these major Western media outlets, and, in some cases based on confidential or private Chinese documents that they've acquired, that the Chinese government first became aware of this deadly outbreak right at the end of December. In other words, on December 30th, the head of the CDC in China learned of the outbreak. And he actually then notified the World Health Organization the following day, on the 31st. And then, as we moved into early January and then mid-January, and at that point, I don't think a single person had died in China at that point. But the first death, I believe, occurred around the 10th or 11th in January. And then a few days after that, the Chinese government really became very worried that the disease was spreading very rapidly, and doing so right before the Chinese New Year travels, when hundreds of millions of Chinese travel all across the country. It's the annual Chinese holiday, the equivalent of Christmas and New Year's and a few other things rolled into one. And since Wuhan was where the disease erupted, is one of the major transit points in China, the Chinese basically felt that they had to crack down very quickly and very harshly to prevent the disease from becoming an epidemic around the country. So I think it was on the, 15th or 20th of January that they ended up basically confining all the 11 million citizens of Wuhan to their houses. They had a complete lockdown in a city of 11 million. Nothing like that had ever happened in the history of the world. And then a few days later, they extended the lockdown to the entire province of Hubei, which had 60 million people. And a few days after that, as they became more and more worried that they hadn't fully contained the disease, they ended up locking down 700 million Chinese, closing down their entire economy. As I mentioned in my article, it's probably a lockdown and a quarantine 1,000 times larger than anything in the previous history of the world. Amazing, and, obviously made all the headlines of all the international newspapers. So the point is, the Chinese government had no idea that this mysterious new disease was spreading in the city until right at the end of December. And, the circumstances of the spread were about as bad as you can possibly imagine, coming right before the annual travels. So when the Trump administration tried to argue that the Chinese had covered up the existence of the disease, I mean, there's really absolutely no basis for it whatsoever. And so a few days or a few weeks after that, the Trump people then, as the outbreak in America got worse and worse, and, at that time, huge numbers of people were dying in New York City every day. The Trump administration switched gears, and they began spreading the story that the disease actually was a Chinese bioweapon, or at least a virus that the Chinese had been working on that had escaped from the viral laboratory of Wuhan, which is one of the main, research laboratories in China that deals with that sort of thing. Now, interestingly enough, that same story had been spreading on the internet in very similar terms almost from the first day the epidemic reached the international headlines. In other words, by early to mid-January, there were a lot of sort of fringe media outlets and social media commenters who were spreading the story that it was a Chinese bioweapon, and that was also sometimes coupled with, ridiculous claims like it had a 10% fatality rate or a 5% fatality rate. Absolutely deadly bioweapon that would destroy China because it had escaped from the Chinese viral laboratory. And there were even some much more exaggerated, sort of rumors and things that were going on. I mean, a lot of it just total nonsense. But the point is, the Trump administration then focused very heavily and very publicly arguing that the virus had escaped from the Wuhan laboratory. Now, as far as I can tell, and, people then afterwards looked into it in tremendous detail, and the Trump people obviously said that they had enormous evidence to support the argument. But in all the months that went by, they never produced any bit of evidence. So it was the sort of thing. The only argument in favor of that hypothesis is that there is a Chinese laboratory in Wuhan that does specialize in viruses. In fact, it had a long relationship with American researchers who, specialize in viruses as well. And it received some American funding and things like that. And also, the fact that they were working on bat viruses, and most of the scientists that look at the COVID virus see that it's closely related to a bat virus, some sort of modified bat virus. So in other words, the argument was that since the virus appeared in the city of Wuhan, and since there's a viral laboratory in Wuhan that deals with roughly similar viruses, it must have escaped from that laboratory. Now, on the face of it, I mean, that's a fairly plausible hypothesis. I mean, in other words, it's a reasonable starting point. You have a laboratory in a city that specializes in bat viruses, and a virus appears in that city that seems closely related to bat viruses. Now, one argument that you can make on the other side is that, if you had that research laboratory, and obviously the people connected with the research laboratory say that they checked their records and there's absolutely no sign that the virus that escaped had anything to do with what they were working on. But, obviously it would be saying that even if it weren't true. But one thing to really keep in mind is that, as I said, most of the evidence and most of the research, when you back into it, when you look at, for example, the speed with which the virus spreads and the contagious nature of the virus and, the number of cases that were found by the time it was detected, it looks like patient zero, the first individual who had the virus, probably became infected by it right around the end of October or the beginning of November. In other words, that's the consensus estimate of most of the Western journalists and researchers who looked into the matter. Now, Wuhan is a city of 11 million people, and the viral outbreak occurred at the height of flu season. So the fact that, for example, a few dozen people, and also the virus generally takes a couple of weeks from the time of infection for it really to make people ill. And, except for older people, not that many people would die from it or really become very seriously ill. So, in a city of 11 million, if, say, by late November, you had a few dozen people infected by the virus who had symptoms. Remember, we're talking about a completely unknown, unsuspected virus that was undetectable by normal techniques because it was a completely new, viral strain. So under those circumstances, even if you had dozens and dozens of people infected by the virus and starting to feel a little bit sick with flu-like symptoms towards the end of November or early December, there really would be very little evidence of that, and it wouldn't come to the attention of the proper authorities until later then. And that's exactly what happened. In other words, a very detailed analysis seemed to show that nobody in the city of Wuhan and its health department became aware of the virus until probably just a few days, basically late December, probably like December 27th, December 25th. And a few days after that, they passed on word of it to the centralized health authorities in the government. And, from there it was passed on to the world. So we're talking about basically a viral outbreak that would be unnoticed by the local health authorities. But on the other hand, if there'd been a known containment breach of this viral laboratory, any sign that a virus had somehow escaped, then obviously the government authorities in China would have been immediately on the lookout for, strange symptom of that virus. And you would expect that under normal circumstances, they would have discovered what was happening a lot sooner than they did. So, that isn't an airtight argument. In other words, it's possible that the virus escaped under such circumstances that nobody in the Wuhan laboratory was aware of it, nobody in the city government was aware of it, and it took until the viral epidemic became very serious, basically 2 months later, before really anybody realized what was happening. But still, a containment breach is the more likely scenario for a viral virus escaping from a laboratory. And if there had been a containment breach, I think the government probably would have been aware of it much sooner. So anyway, that's basically where things stand in terms of the Trump people focusing on the fact that there is a laboratory in that city of 11 million, and the outbreak occurred there, and basically just connecting those things together as what they argue is virtual proof that it escaped from the laboratory of Wuhan. So that was sort of the argument that the Trump people were making, and I really, and most other people, the mainstream media and most sort of more mainstream analysts were very skeptical of it, and they were asking, well, do you have any proof? And the Trump people certainly said, oh, yes, we have very strong proof. But 6 or 7 or 8 months went by and nothing ever came out. So it's pretty clear that the Trump administration actually had no proof at all.
Well, they got away with that with 9/11, Ron. As you may recall, the Bush administration and Tony Blair said they had absolute proof that bin Laden did it. And, of course, they never produced it.
Yeah. And the other thing also is that there were various leaks by the CIA and other government intelligence sources to the media saying that our intelligence agencies tended to disagree with that verdict. And as far as they could tell, there was no evidence it was a viral leak from the Wuhan lab. So, with our intelligence agencies saying that they had no evidence of a leak, and with Trump being very unpopular in the media, the combination of those two factors was that the story got some traction, but not a huge amount of traction outside of the conservative media. So basically, after a few weeks of, the Trump people playing it up very heavily, you had about 40% or 45% of Americans believing that they thought it was highly likely or reasonably likely that it was a viral leak from the Wuhan laboratory, because that's basically the percentage of Americans who supported Donald Trump. And 70% of Republicans believed that, but the rest of the country didn't. So it really became more of a partisan issue than anything else. So at that point, then, the story really sort of tapered off, partly because America ended up having other problems of its own. And George Floyd died in Minneapolis police custody. And with 200 riots, 200 of our cities facing rioting and looting and burning, and massive protests all around the country, the Wuhan lab story just sort of faded away. And then people focused much more on Trump running for re-election and all of those sorts of things. So the story pretty much died out for about 6 or 8 months. Now, all the time that was happening, I'd actually written an article back in April, right after some of that started to come out, pointing out, a few things that should be considered as an alternative explanation of the, epidemic that at that point just reached the United States. First of all, one thing I noticed right at the beginning of the media coverage, when the epidemic first began in China, in early to mid-January when it started reaching the headlines, was that all the journalists immediately pointed out it had hit China at exactly the absolute worst time and place, right before the Lunar New Year holidays, and in the major transit city of Wuhan. In other words, you couldn't imagine such incredibly bad luck for the Chinese to have been hit at a point where if they hadn't taken that massive lockdown approach, it really would have infected the entire country with devastating impact. I mean, probably many, many, many millions of Chinese would have died. Their economy and society would have been severely damaged, even maybe crippled for years. And
so it's sort of like us.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, but I mean much worse, because basically we're talking about, 1 billion people. And, it just would have been an incredible disaster for their country. So, sometimes you're hit with bad luck. But it seemed to me as soon as the story of like a lab leak started getting out there, I pointed out in comments and everything like that on my website, well, at that stage, I didn't see any evidence that it was any sort of bioweapon or that it had been, a product of human engineering or human effort. But it seemed to me that if it were a bioweapon, the fact that it suddenly appeared in China at absolutely the worst possible time and place seemed awfully suspicious. Because if it were a lab leak could happen at any point of the year. It's a random event. And so, the fact that it hit China in the worst 10-day or 30-day period of the year in an extremely bad location seemed rather suspicious to me. The other thing that also made me a bit suspicious, probably by late February, early March, I became aware of this massive sort of fringe media effort to vilify China and to claim that it was a Chinese bioweapon or a Chinese lab leak or something like that. That was, probably a few weeks before the Trump people got on board. At that point, it was confined to, Zero Hedge or Steve Bannon's podcast or sort of more fringe outlets. And it just seemed to me strange that, all these arguments claiming that it was a Chinese lab leak or a Chinese bioweapon would have popped up so very, very quickly and in such a coordinated fashion, because it seemed to me that normally if some mysterious disease appeared somewhere in the world, it would take people at least a few weeks to sort of decide to use it as anti-Chinese propaganda, rather than to jump in there almost from the time anybody had heard about the virus with all these coordinated efforts on various platforms. In fact, I think the first claim came out as early as January 6th or 7th, which, is very, very early in the whole epidemic. I mean, most people had never even heard of the disease or even Wuhan at that point.
And certainly nobody knew it was going to become as big as it did.
Exactly. So that just seems suspicious to me. Now, the truth is, when you're examining issues of history or analyzing what's going on, suspicion is one thing, strong evidence is another thing. In other words, it's reasonable to be suspicious, and suspicious means you start thinking about the issue, investigating it a little more carefully. But it doesn't mean you can jump the gun and say the suspicion, is proof that it is sort of some sort of coordinated effort by the Western media. But it did seem quite suspicious to me. The other thing I sort of noticed, gradually, a few people brought to my attention articles here and there that were providing a different narrative. In other words, articles suggesting that, pointing out the fact that America had for many years an extremely extensive biowarfare weapons program that was largely based on the bat viruses, exactly the same bat viruses that were closely connected with COVID-19 and with the Chinese biolab. So in other words, it wasn't just that the Chinese were doing investigation of that type of virus. It was the core of the American program.
The Americans sent it over to Wuhan, right? They banned gain-of-function research in the U.S., and shipped it over to Wuhan and funded it there.
Yeah, exactly. There were research ties, and we were funding some of the research activities of that lab because, just as you say, some of those research techniques had been banned in the United States. So some of the people involved in those techniques made arrangements with Wuhan to continue them. So the point about it is that to say it was a bat virus and that Wuhan was working on bat viruses sounds very suspicious. But when you find out that America's been working on exactly the same sort of bat viruses, then suddenly you have a mixture of suspicions. And for example, one of the writers who wrote a very important, very early article on it was Whitney Webb, a really excellent sort of investigative journalist. And it turns out that time she was associated with Mint Press, which was an alternative media outlet that, was very daring and sometimes published many of her articles about Epstein or 9/11 or, things that certainly are quite controversial. But apparently they were unwilling to publish her very, detailed article about American biowarfare research into bat viruses. So I ended up publishing it. And if I hadn't published it, it probably would have gotten very little attention by comparison. And instead it got, tens of thousands of page views. Then also I came across a sort of eccentric individual, eccentric American expat living in China, who started blogging on the outbreak. And he wrote a very, very long, sort of somewhat convoluted series of blog posts on the disease epidemic in China, and I ended up, it turns out it was freely republishable. So I republished on my website, and we ended up getting a huge number of page views, like 90,000 or 100,000, many of them even from China. And among the interesting things he pointed out was that in the previous 2 years, China had been hit with mysterious viral outbreaks, but targeting their livestock. For example, in 2018, China had been swept by a form of avian flu that had destroyed much of their poultry industry, a viral outbreak that seemed sort of mysterious that suddenly popped up in China and devastated their poultry industry. And then in 2019, another mysterious virus had appeared that wiped out 40% of their primary meat source, which was their pig herds, their pig farms. And in fact, that outbreak was so massive that got into all the international newspapers. I'd been reading about it in my morning New York Times business section, where it mentioned that China had lost 40% of all of its pigs in a period of a few months because of this mysterious virus. And since that was their main meat source, the focus in the business section was how, it would be great for American farmers because China would have to buy huge quantities of American meat to, basically supplement their vastly diminished domestic herds. And so at the time I thought, that's sort of interesting. But this fellow, this blogger in China, pointed out that when you're looking at it, in 2018, China suffers a mysterious viral epidemic that wipes out much of their poultry industry. In 2019, they suffer an even bigger mysterious viral epidemic that wipes out 40% of their main meat source. And then the following year, right at the beginning of 2000, suddenly you have another mysterious viral epidemic that this time targets people, human beings.
It's almost as if somebody keeps upping the ante.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, that doesn't prove anything, but we're starting to look at very, very suspicious patterns. Another thing that blogger pointed out was that right before the epidemic appeared in Wuhan, Wuhan had been the site of the World Military Games, and 300 American military servicemen had come to participate. Now, again, that doesn't prove anything. And there, as far as I can tell, there's no evidence. There have been some rumors that some of the participants were ill at the time, but I haven't seen anything solid. And, you'd expect, the fact that a few of them then became ill later on, maybe they caught the virus in Wuhan or something like that. But, still, when you're talking about a situation where the military games ended right at the end of October, and by an amazing coincidence, that's independently the date that all the journalists and researchers have decided was right around the time the viral epidemic appeared. In other words, none of them talk about the games at Wuhan, but all of the Western analysts, researchers, and journalists agree that the virus patient zero of the virus appeared right at the end of October or the beginning of November. And, when you're talking about 300 American military servicemen, along with thousands of people from other countries, military officers from other countries being there, that seems an amazing coincidence. And the way I put it is if 300 Chinese military officers have been paying a long extended visit to Chicago, and then as soon as they left, Chicago suddenly suffered a mysterious, deadly viral epidemic, that would make an awful lot of Americans extremely suspicious. I mean, we're talking about a tremendous coincidence of timing. Another thing that came up, and, at the time it seemed to me, if American intelligence were launching a biowarfare attack against the city of Wuhan in China, using the military games as cover would be absolutely ideal, because if there are 300 American servicemen and thousands of military officers from other countries in Wuhan, slipping a couple of operatives into that group of 300 and having them then release the viral agent while they're there, with any actions that they do completely, benefiting from the cover of thousands of military officers from all over the world traveling around the city, sightseeing, walking all around. I mean, that would be an ideal scenario to release a viral agent at that point. And interestingly enough, now, at this point, none of this had been discussed anywhere in the media, or even the alternative media, as far as I could tell. In other words, it was confined largely to a few comments that I've been making on websites and a couple of these articles that then I'd republished from these obscure courses. Whitney Webb's, article that her own publication refused to print, and then that eccentric blogger in China who had a lot of strange beliefs on other things, but that doesn't matter. In other words, he brought to my attention the military games coincidence of timing and also the other viral epidemics in China. Now, it turns out I discovered that on actually the Saker's website, you might be familiar with him. He's sort of an alternative military analyst.
Yeah, he's been on the show many times.
Oh, excellent. It turns out I came across the fact that somebody had written a couple of long, detailed comments on his website, just ordinary comments, but very detailed comments. And the individual claimed to be a 40-year veteran of American biodefense. And his comments were very detailed. They seemed to show a lot of in-depth knowledge of the issue. And when I checked around, what my sort of investigation seemed to confirm that he was what he claimed to be.
So you're talking about old microbiologist. And
yes, exactly.
So can you reveal your sources and methods? How did you get his bona fides?
Well, I can't be sure. I'd actually rather not.
Okay.
Sort of, because the thing is, he in fact in some of his statements said he was sort of cautious about the things he was saying because he could. Also cautious about his identity and everything like that for fairly obvious reasons. And in his lengthy comments, which I ended up then making arrangements to republish as a 3,400-word article, just taking his comments and republishing them as an article, he really pretty much took exactly the same position. He said, his sense of it was that it probably was an American biowarfare attack, for the same sort of reasons I was giving. And he went into a lot of detail of the American biowarfare program and, his familiarity with it and things like that. And, so it just it made me more comfortable that somebody who seemed to be a top professional, experienced professional in that field, came to very similar conclusions than I had. And he added a few details, but it was more that the fact that we had an additional source making some of these arguments. Now, one thing that struck me is, as I said, from early part of January, there was this massive international coordinated propaganda campaign blaming the viral outbreak on a Chinese laboratory and a Chinese virus, a virus that was, produced probably by Chinese researchers. So you had this massive international propaganda campaign attacking China on that point. And you had absolute silence in the other direction. In other words, nobody almost anywhere, as far as I could tell, was raising the remote possibility of the outbreak being an American biowarfare attack. And the only reason people started, I think, to focus on it, as far as I can tell, was I sort of hunted up these obscure little individuals. In other words, Whitney Webb's Spike column, that eccentric blogger in China, and then the comments by old microbiologists.
Yeah, did you see Jeff Brown's work at that time? Because I think he was on it pretty early, too.
Oh, yeah. In fact, he was, I think, working with that same blogger in China. To be honest, I admit I wasn't really following his stuff. But I think he ended up, wasn't he actually on a show with that same blogger I'm talking about in China?
Yeah, I think I actually had them on my show at that point. Yeah, so I was one of those early people gesturing in the same direction, too.
Oh, exactly. But what I mean to say is that there was no organized effort focusing on that. In other words, you're probably perfectly right. In other words, you were probably talking about it, and these other individuals were talking about it. I was republishing a few of these columns here and there, and you had that blogger in China, and just as you say, Jeff Brown talking about it. But these were sort of individuals here and there, not working in any coordinated fashion. In other words, the extent of coordination was probably when you had two of them on your show, right. or when I republished a couple of their columns on my website, and that's not sort of heavy resources coordination. While on the other hand, you had massive efforts, including, for example, Radio Free Asia, which is government-sponsored and under the authority of Mike Pompeo and everything like that, spreading all these stories around. So when you have a situation where a propaganda campaign begins so quickly after the events it's focusing on, that would have to make you very suspicious. In other words, it seems to me it would take a little time to get a propaganda campaign organized and off the ground, unless you had advanced knowledge of what was about to happen. And so, again, we're talking about suspicion in that direction, while on the other hand, the fact that there was absolutely no propaganda campaign on the pro-Chinese or anti-American side that was beyond, you and me or something like that, that seems to show that that the Chinese were entirely caught flat-footed on the whole thing. And in effect, the way I describe it in the article, they in effect had lost the propaganda war even before they'd even realized they were in one. Because you had all these rumors of Chinese biolabs spreading on the internet. One thing that recently came out, you're familiar probably with the Atlantic Council?
Yeah, they called me a super spreader.
Oh, of course. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they blame me for everything you've done better than I have.
Exactly. You brought their report to my attention. I'm sorry. Just stupid of me. So, they published that long 54-page article tracing, quote, all the conspiracy theories regarding the outbreak of the COVID virus and going through in tremendous detail and everything like that. And when you look at it, there's absolutely no sign of any activity on the pro-Chinese side and massive activity on the anti-Chinese side, which really would tend to raise suspicions. So we're talking about all of these sort of suspicious factors coming together. Another thing that really is quite interesting. Now, at this stage, a number of early scientists came in. They said, the virus is definitely natural. It's not artificial. And obviously, if it's natural, then it couldn't have come out of a laboratory. But then you had various other researchers coming up on the internet with extremely long and detailed scientific-looking articles claiming that it obviously was artificial. It obviously was a bioengineered virus, and suggesting that it had certain clear relationships to the viruses that the Chinese were working on allegedly in their laboratory. Now, the strange thing about it is, these things that appeared on the internet, in one case, apparently it was a major project by entirely anonymous researchers. In other words, a bunch of entirely anonymous individuals got together on the internet and produced a huge body of apparently, very detailed scientific research work supporting the notion of it being a bioweapon, and in particular a Chinese bioweapon. Now, various people have gone through and looked at their material and said that, well, it's not at all convincing. But it still seems sort of a little bit odd that a bunch of anonymous people would get together and put in such tremendous efforts to produce such detailed scientific material that so absolutely supports the position of the Trump administration and, the people trying to blame it on China. The other individual who did a very detailed report, I think it was like 12,000 or 17,000 words long, which I read when it came out. There was some obscure part-time blogger who focused on gerontology, which had nothing to do with viruses. And he produced a massive, massive scientific study on the internet that he published, which he released a week after Trump denounced the virus as being clearly, a Chinese lab creation, which supported exactly that case. And, I read through it, and I'm not an expert on viral research, so it wasn't at all possible for me to really form a clear judgment. But some people who've looked into the matter more clearly say that a lot of his arguments really aren't that strong. But he had hundreds of charts and graphs, very professional charts and graphs, enormously detailed work. I mean, something that you would think would have taken like a team of many, many top professionals working in dedicated fashion for months, nonstop, to produce and then put up on the internet. And he sort of claimed that, he just did it as a part-time thing on his own because he was interested in the subject or something, and even though he apparently had no background in the field. So, we're talking about a situation that seemed extremely similar to some of the propaganda that came out from intelligence agencies at the time of the Iraq War. All of this detailed stuff about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction that, then was leaked on the internet or leaked to reporters or, produced by mysterious sources and everything like that. So it just seems to me that when some person who's a part-time blogger in a different area produces such a massively detailed study, it really tends to, have the fingerprints of a heavily backed government intelligence effort. And I would just be extraordinarily suspicious if he actually produced it all by himself for his own reasons. And it, much more likely just came from the CIA or something like that. So, anyway, I really have put so much time into all of this background and the growing suspicions. But the point is, as of a few months ago, the whole issue had sort of died down and been left pretty much in limbo because people were focused on other things. But I've noticed just in the last few weeks, there's been a recovery of interest. For example, with a journalist in the Washington Post reviving the lab leak story, a columnist in the Wall Street Journal reviving it, and in most interesting fashion, a very liberal and fairly prominent novelist, but who's written actually a lot of nonfiction work as well, named Nicholson Baker, wrote a massive 12,000-word cover story for New York Magazine, a very respectable outlet, going through all of these scientific issues in tremendous detail. Right at the time the viral outbreak occurred, he had just finished a nonfiction book of his, which got good reviews, talking about the long history of American secret biowarfare research. And in that, he found out that America had a number of lab leaks during the years in which a certain number of people had died. And so that made him think that maybe it really was a Chinese lab leak. So he ended up discussing the issue and going through analyzing the evidence with a number of different scientists that he spoke to, and they seemed to think there was divided opinion. In other words, some people seemed to believe the virus was probably natural. Others seemed to believe it was more likely artificial. There was no proof in either case, but that basically was sort of the point he was making in his article. So what we're talking about is a huge debate going on in the United States, which now may be starting up again, arguing about, is the virus simply the natural virus that the official verdict on it by respectable media claims, or is it an artificial virus that came from a Chinese lab leak? But what seems to me really quite remarkable is that virtually nobody anywhere, with the exception of you and myself and a few other people, have focused on what seems to me a much more likely scenario, in that it was probably a biowarfare attack from America against China, because of all of those very suspicious questions of timing and, unlikely chances all happening at the same time. Now, the thing that I think, the piece of evidence that came out in last April, that raised the whole issue from a question of highly suspicious timing and circumstantial evidence to something much, much stronger than that, was that when Trump was doing his best to sort of try to argue that, nobody realized what was happening. It wasn't his fault that so many Americans were dying of the viral outbreak. It turns out, as you can imagine, our intelligence agencies did whatever they could to sort of cover themselves on that. And four independent intelligence sources, leaked to ABC News the fact that the Defense Intelligence Agency had published in late November a secret report which had distributed to top American officials, including the White House, saying that Wuhan was in the middle of a disastrous viral outbreak that could be cataclysmic, and that American troops in East Asia should certainly protect themselves against the consequences of that viral outbreak in that region. Now, again, secret reports like this come out all the time, and it doesn't really surprise me too much that nobody in government paid much attention to it, because there are many, many secret reports constantly being distributed. But the key issue of that ABC News story was the timing. That secret intelligence report talking about a cataclysmic viral outbreak taking place in Wuhan was actually distributed in late November. It was allegedly produced the second week of November. Now, nobody in the Chinese government was aware of the outbreak until the end of December, 6 or 7 weeks after the secret report was produced by the American DIA. And, the truth is, when you look at the timing of the outbreak, in early to mid-November, there probably were a dozen people who felt mildly ill in Wuhan, a city of 11 million. By late November, it was probably a few dozen people at the height of flu season. When you're getting into December, maybe a few people more than that were getting ill. But at the time that secret report was produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, there was virtually no evidence anywhere in the world of what they were writing about.
But
and certainly
we sure have great intelligence, don't we?
Exactly. And now, at the time it came out, as I said, 4 separate government intelligence sources leaked the existence of the report to ABC News. But immediately, once it got on the news and everybody started talking about it, people noticed the timing issue. And so the spokesman for the Defense Intelligence Agency then came out and said, there's no report. The report never existed. And nobody else was willing to comment to the media. So in other words, it's not that then the top officials of the DIA said the report never existed. It's just they said, we refuse to comment. And the spokesman, who's paid to lie, or paid to say whatever he's told to say, said the report never existed. But then a few days later, Israeli television revealed that the report had actually not only existed, but had been sent to Israel and had been distributed to all the different NATO countries. So when you have an independent confirmation of the existence of that report by Israeli intelligence through Israeli TV, and 4 separate U.S. intelligence sources originally describing the report, it seems almost certain that the report existed.
And it seems like we've got the gang that can't shoot straight running the country.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the question is, at that point, with all of the amazingly coincidental facts regarding the outbreak of the disease, and with the virtual smoking gun of a report published by our DIA describing a cataclysmic outbreak in Wuhan, a couple of months before there was a cataclysmic outbreak, and when the disease was spreading silently and invisibly to a tiny number of people, it seems very likely that it was a biowarfare attack.
And that's what I told the Atlantic Council journalist, or rather the AP journalist working with the Atlantic Council, and told him to go talk to you about it, but I guess he didn't.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of, we're talking about obviously something that's very hot, and, it's obviously something that would be right now. If you look at the data,
it's so hot, Ron. They're going to kick us off the air here in less than a minute. That's the network that's going to do it.
Okay. Well, anyway, I just want to say that what we're talking about is the greatest disaster probably in the last 100 years of American society, since the Second World War or the Great Depression, maybe since the Civil War. Enormous loss of life, lockdowns, disruption to the economy. And there seems very strong evidence that it was basically the accidental blowback from an American biowarfare attack against China, very likely by a small group of rogue operatives connected with the deep state neocons. That would be my guess. There's no way of knowing who was behind it. But based on Trump's behavior, he certainly was unaware of what had happened. And so he certainly didn't know that it was a biowarfare.
Yeah, he was like Bush reading about pet goats in school
exactly.
in Florida.
I mean, Trump was exactly in the Bush position of reading about his pet goat.
and Trump ended up being made the goat and sacrificed.
Yes,
it.
exactly. So anyway, I mean, I think we're talking about something that, the facts, and the fact that this evidence came out from ABC News and from Israeli TV. We're talking very mainstream sources. We're not talking about fringe leaks. We're talking about as mainstream as you can get. And I don't see any way of arguing on the other side of it.
Yeah, I think it's a very strong case, too, and I appreciate your having the guts to make it, because, as you say, this is a hot potato issue, the kind of stuff we do here at Truth Jihad Radio. Well, thank you so much, Ron Unz. It's always wonderful talking with you. Keep up the great work. God bless. This is Truth Jihad Radio. Kevin Barrett signing off till next week. See you then.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio.